Okay, we are back here on Intercepted. I'm Jeremy Scahill. Hillary Clinton has certainly not disappeared from public life after losing the election to Donald Trump in November. In fact, she's been remarkably visible of late and has not shied away from sharing her views on why she believes she lost the election.
Did we make mistakes? Of course we did. Did I make mistakes? Oh my gosh, yes. You know, you'll read my confession and my request for absolution. But the reason why I believe we lost were the intervening events in the last 10 days.
Hillary Clinton also cited allegations about Russia.
Every day that goes by, we learn more about some of the unprecedented interference, including from a foreign power whose leader is not a member of my fan club. And so I think it is real. It is very much a part of the landscape politically and socially and economically.
Now, why Hillary Clinton lost the race is a subject of great contention in this country. Her supporters often chalk it up to some combination of Russian interference, hatred of the Clintons, hatred of her that goes back to her time as First Lady, sexism, the focus on her private email server when she was Secretary of State, the actions of FBI Director James Comey in the closing days of the election, and the role of third-party candidates. And those include my next guest, the Green Party's 2016 presidential candidate, Dr. Jill Stein. I reached out to Jill Stein this week after I watched the interview Sunday, that NBC News broadcast of former Fox News host turned NBC host Megyn Kelly with Russian President Vladimir Putin. During that interview, Megyn Kelly asked Putin about the allegations that Russian hackers sought to influence the U.S. election through hacking and other means. And she also asked Putin about a now quite infamous dinner that took place on December 10th, 2015 in Moscow.
Did you know General Michael Flynn? He came over here for a dinner, a photo of which has been widely circulated in the American media. What was the nature of your relationship with him?
You and I personally have a much closer relationship than I had with Mr. Flynn. You and I met yesterday evening. You and I have been working together all day today, and now we're meeting again. When I came to the event for our company, Russia Today, and sat down at the table, next to me there was a gentleman sitting on one side. I made my speech, then we talked about some other stuff, and I got up and left. And then afterwards I was told, you know, there was an American gentleman, he was involved in some things. He used to be in the intelligence services. That's it. I didn't even really talk to him. That's the extent of my acquaintance with Mr. Flynn.
Now, the dinner that Megyn Kelly was asking Vladimir Putin about was a gala sponsored by the Russian state television network RT, and Putin was its keynote speaker. The photo from that evening, I'm sure many of you, if not all of you, have seen it, was circulated all over the media and the web, and it shows Vladimir Putin next to General Michael Flynn at the dinner table. Flynn, of course, is very close to Donald Trump and was his national security advisor for a brief period until Trump reluctantly fired him. Flynn was paid upwards of $45,000 to give a speech that week in Russia at a conference sponsored by RT. Flynn now is under investigation for a range of issues, extending from his meetings with Russian officials to his paid lobbying work for the Turkish government to the dinner that night with Vladimir Putin. In response to requests from the U.S. Senate to testify, Michael Flynn has taken the Fifth Amendment, but he, this week, has just handed over hundreds of pages of documents to the Senate. So we'll have to see what comes of that. Anyway, I bring all of this up because Jill Stein was also at that dinner with Flynn and Putin. In fact, she was seated at the exact same table. And it's one of the many things I want to discuss with her. If you look around social media or you do some basic Googling, or if you watch MSNBC a whole lot, you will see a lot of vitriol aimed at Jill Stein when they talk about her at all. She's been blamed directly for Clinton losing. She has been accused for taking votes away from the Democrats. Some people have even said she should be held responsible for Donald Trump pulling out of the Paris Climate Agreement. Jill Stein is a powerful woman for being the head of such a small political party, huh? Well, blasting her as a spoiler in the election is much of what you will hear about Jill Stein in the corporate media, if they even cover her at all. But she is a fierce activist for peace, the environment, workers' rights, and she is also spearheading some of the efforts aimed at investigating the insecurity of the voting systems in the U.S., as well as pushing for presidential debates to include candidates that are not just Democrats and Republicans. Dr. Jill Stein, I want to welcome you to Intercepted.
It's really great to be here.
Let's just start with a very simple question. Why do you believe Donald Trump won?
Put it this way. This was one of the most toxic elections in our history, more influenced by big corporate money and corporate media than any ever before, with the most disliked and untrusted candidates that the American people have ever expressed an opinion about, in which most people who voted for Donald Trump, according to several polls, they were not for Donald Trump, they were against Hillary Clinton. So I think that is a fairly, critical factor, but I think there were many ringers, unfortunate circumstances that converged in this election, having to do with the fact, what's the unifier here? The unifier is that this election system is extremely screwed up. Nearly half of Americans chose not to vote. We deserve a better election system going forward, and that includes, of course, cybersecurity.
Now, I think that most of the mentions of your name particularly during the closing months of the campaign, came in the form of attacks on you on the air, in print, from pundits, basically saying, both preemptively and then after the fact, you're going to be responsible for Donald Trump winning the election. I want you to have a platform here to answer that question in an in-depth way, and not just, well, here's this percentage of vote or that percentage of vote, but your overall view of why you push back against that and what the truth of it is in your view.
Most of that suppression, the effort to suppress an opposition political voice, most of that is coming from a community that's terribly afraid of Donald Trump, and for very good reasons. Donald Trump is extremely dangerous. He's toxic. He is both a symptom of a political system in crisis, and he's part of that crisis, making that crisis worse. So I really understand that fear and that anguish and that sort of desperation. We got to find a reason, we got to blame somebody, and maybe that'll fix it. That said, it's really important to stand back and realize that the solution for a democracy on life support is not less democracy. Silencing political opposition is a very dangerous thing to do. That's what they do in Russia, which we are making such an effort not to be influenced by. We would be copycatting Russia to fully silence our political opposition. It's pretty difficult right now as a political opponent to get on the ballot, to be heard in the media, to reach out to the American public who is desperate for a different kind of politics going forward. So, the answer here is not to suppress independent, non-corporate voices, which in fact hold the solutions to what truly ails us. The solution is to change our voting system, which is a simple thing to do and has been front and center, really, of our agenda from the start.
Which part of the Constitution says that we can only have two parties in this country?
Exactly.
Did you read that part?
No. And in fact, when we originated, we had no parties in this country. And the parties that have always been affiliated with our real progress forward have generally been independent third parties, whether you look at the abolition of slavery. So, when people call these independent third parties spoilers, that's exactly what the abolitionists were called. They were called spoilers for daring to confront a very toxic and dangerous political system that kept us stuck in a very dangerous status quo. So, there's no doubt we need to open up this process. We need a political process that creates multi-partisan democracy. That's really where democracies get their best shot at moving forward and solving our crises.
Well, clearly, very powerful forces in this country saw both you and Gary Johnson, the Libertarian Party candidate, as very problematic for Hillary Clinton in particular. I mean, the Trump people were worried about a third-party insurgent run that really would represent the kind of traditional GOP view of things. But in your case, you had Michelle Obama on the campaign trail saying,
and if you vote for someone other than Hillary, or if you don't vote at all, then you are helping to elect Hillary's opponent. Remember, It's not about voting for the perfect candidate. There is no such person.
President Obama himself said that.
If you vote for a third-party candidate who's got no chance to win, that's a vote for Trump.
Ultimately, Bernie Sanders went on the tour, and he was dispatched to say that.
Before you cast a protest vote, because either Clinton or Trump will become president, think hard about it. Think about what the country looks like and whether you're comfortable of 4 years of a Trump presidency.
And on election night, Rachel Maddow on MSNBC added up the percentage of your votes and Gary Johnson's vote and basically said this election of Donald Trump was made possible by Gary Johnson and Jill Stein.
If you vote for somebody who can't win for president, it means that you don't care who wins for president.
Now, that's what you call alternative math. We know that Kellyanne Conway uses alternative facts. Well, Rachel Maddow uses alternative math. And it's based on the premise that if we only wish that pigs fly, pigs can fly. You know, so let's wish that people who vote green would vote Democratic if deprived of a candidate. But in fact, we have some math that tells us how people would vote according to what they said in exit polls. We know from exit polls about 61% of Greens simply would not vote. Of the remaining 39%, well over a third of them, 36% in fact, would have voted for Donald Trump. So you can't just take
36% of
my voters would have voted for Donald Trump in the same way that we know Sanders voters were coming out of Trump's campaign as well, and many of them went back to Trump's campaign.
Now, Jill, I wanted to get your response to this story that was published by The Intercept this week based on this top secret NSA document outlining alleged Russian attempts to hack into companies that provide software used as part of the voting system in some states inside of the United States.
You know, with the caveat that I haven't looked at the whole report yet, let's forget for a moment who done it. The critical thing here shows that our election system is in fact vulnerable. It's vulnerable to security breaches. And we don't know from this report, as I understand it, we don't know if this security breach was successful. We don't know what it did on the receiving end at the level of the voting machines. That is exactly why the machines need to be examined. Their software code needs to be examined to find out if, in fact, they were hacked and what the consequences of that are. Now, one question that occurs to me is we currently have lawsuits in 2 states. But this is obviously much broader than 2 states, and there may be reason for a much deeper examination of what's gone on in this election with our voting machines. And obviously, we need to take steps to protect ourselves and our voting system going forward. There's a pretty simple solution here, a drop-dead simple solution, which is that we shouldn't be relying on hackable technology. To start with, we should have hand-counted paper ballots, which is a simple technology, puts it in the light of day under community observation, essentially. So there are many ways to solve this problem that get us to security. We could also improve the standards. Let's start by having some standards for security in these machines. There are many ways to solve this problem, and it desperately needs attention. And I think, you know, the silver lining here is that what the election integrity community has been screaming for, you know, here we now have a big smoking gun.
You know, people often mention this, but I've never really heard anyone ask you with any length of time for the answer to actually explain it. So I want to do that right now. There's this famous picture, well, it's now become famous, of this dinner table where Vladimir Putin is seated next to General Michael Flynn, and you are sort of directly across from them at this sort of intimate round table. How did you end up at that table or in Russia at the same time as General Michael Flynn from the beginning?
All right, so let me just start with the mythology that this was an intimate round table. There were like 11 people at the table. I think only 8 are shown in the picture because of the angle it's taken from. And if you look closely, if you blow up the picture, you'll see there's a chair between Michael Flynn and Putin, which was occupied by the head of RT. She happened to be introducing Putin at that moment. Putin and I think 3 rather strapping men kind of stormed in just before Putin was to give a speech. So they really weren't at the table for very long, maybe 5 minutes, maybe 20 tops. Nobody introduced anybody to anybody. There was no translator. The Russians spoke Russian. The 4 people who spoke English spoke English. There was a guy sitting next to Flynn named Cyril Svoboda, who was the deputy prime minister of the Czech Republic way back, and also the foreign minister, etc. He spoke both languages. And what I read afterwards was that he had briefly translated between Flynn and Putin, and it amounted to, "Hi, how you doing? Okay." That was it. So that was the great conversation. Nobody else talked to anybody across language barriers that I could see. I assumed these were his bodyguards who came in with him. Turns out they weren't his bodyguards. They were like his chief of staff and communications, but nobody cared to make introductions. This wasn't intended to be a discussion of any sort. I spent just about the whole evening talking to the German former foreign minister sitting next to me, Willy Wimmer, and we had a very interesting conversation. But I think that was the only substantive conversation that took place around that table.
And then Putin gets up to give his speech.
Yep.
And then does he return to the table?
No, then they walk out. He was basically there to give a speech. This was not some kind of a dinner meeting. Nobody even met anybody. I didn't hear any words exchanged between English speakers and Russians.
Did Putin come around the table to say hi to everyone?
So I believe it was just before he made his speech, I think. He did a very perfunctory, rapid-fire tour around the table. Didn't say a word, just handshake, 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 handshake. That was it. No names exchanged.
How much did you know about General Michael Flynn before you sat down there at that dinner?
Just about nothing. I mean, the name sort of rang a bell. I thought it was interesting that there was a general at this dinner. So he actually came over to me and introduced himself before we sat down.
He's a very affable guy, I will say, when you talk to him.
I can see why people like him. He doesn't give the air of being all full of himself like you would expect a general to be. He came over and introduced himself, and I gave him my elevator speech about the peace offensive, because that's really why I was there. I was there to build international solidarity to the extent I could around a peace consensus to establish a weapons embargo and a freeze or seizing of the bank accounts of those countries that continue to fund terrorism, namely Saudi Arabia. That's really why I was there. I had a very specific mission. And then also, to broach nuclear weapons and resuming nuclear disarmament talks, and maybe something about the climate and green energy while we're at it. I was there with basically my campaign agenda. There was nothing secretive about why I was there, and we put out press releases. My statements at the conference, in fact, are all on the web. They're all very public. And I gave Flynn my comment.
Yeah.
And it was clear this was not going to go anywhere. The conversation was over before it started. That's as much contact as I had with him.
When I saw that photo way before the Flynn-Trump stuff started up, because I've followed Michael Flynn's career for a very long time before he was really well known in public, because he was General Stanley McChrystal's chief of intelligence during the height of the Joint Special Operations Command's kill-capture operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. And, Flynn was a part of these elite covert operations that where the U.S. Special Ops Forces were just killing their way across Iraq and also running their own parallel detention and interrogation programs. So my initial, view of this was, my God, they're letting, the U.S. government is allowing General Michael Flynn to sit at a table with Putin and Jill Stein. From one end, you have, why would they put somebody with such knowledge about where bodies are buried, so to speak, next to Putin? And also, why would Flynn agree to sit at a table with Jill Stein, who has made abundantly clear that his life's work is something that she stands in opposition to on a policy level? I'm just saying, that was my first view of it was this is an insane group of people that have collected at a table together.
Well, I think that reflects the reality that we were not, in fact, at the table together. We were physically at the same table. But, you got to know that there was this really incredible show that was going on that included the Russian chorus and an opera singer. And there was just nonstop entertainment. There was a lot of volume. And there was no talk across the table. And it was clearly not intended to be a discussion.
What did you eat? You're vegetarian, right?
I'm a vegetarian, yes. Well, actually, I'm a fish-eating vegetarian.
You're a pescatarian.
Yes. There were lots of great vegetable dishes and salad, and so I was able to pick my way around.
Come on, Jill, you got a dish with us here.
Oh, I know.
Caviar? Not asking if you ate caviar. Was there caviar present?
Not that I was aware of. If there was, I probably would have eaten
Bad
it, but I didn't
Russians.
see any.
And your intent in going there was not just to go to this dinner. There was a broader context.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the dinner had absolutely no relevance
So
to
why
my
were
trip.
why were you there at the time?
I was there because RT was hosting this conference as its 10th anniversary. And also the Paris Climate Summit was happening. So I thought, well, as long as I'm going to the Paris Summit, I might as well also go see if I can talk to the Russians, because we need to talk to each other. In the words of John F. Kennedy,
that we shall never negotiate out of fear, and we shall never fear to negotiate.
I sort of came of age during the Cold War, when physicians were making a great effort to talk to Russians in order to achieve nuclear weapons treaties. And we were successful. And that was deeply ingrained in me during my training, that it's really important to talk to people and that nuclear weapons are a consummate health issue. All the other health stuff doesn't matter, if the nuclear weapons are going to go off. So, I take that as a very serious personal and political responsibility. So to not go to Russia at a time when all hell is breaking loose, to not go and bring the message of the Greens, which is a very important international message of peace. It's a very different paradigm, and it's a paradigm that needs to be resurrected and looked at. So I was very interested to go have that conversation. There were going to be media from all over the world, including China's and India's, as well as talk to people. There were many peace advocates who were there: Ray McGovern, Rocky Anderson.
Rocky Anderson, the former mayor of Salt Lake City.
Who
Ray
ran
McGovern,
for the Justice Party.
Yes. Former CIA analyst.
Jesse Ventura, for that matter.
Former pro wrestler. And this is like a quiz here. And former governor of Minnesota. Current RT host with his own show.
Yes.
There's Flynn, of course, we now know was paid a pretty substantial, well, by most American standards, in terms of working people, a pretty substantial amount of money to appear there. Did they pay you?
No, they did not offer to pay me. They did offer to pay my way, and I said, no, thank you.
So let me get this straight, because I've seen people erroneous. So you're saying they did not pay your transportation?
I would not accept money for transportation. They did not pay my hotel fare either at a Russian state hotel.
Did you have any interaction with Flynn at all at the conference, or was he just there to do that event at the dinner?
He was actually there to give a talk at the conference, and I was actually in the room, but I was busy preparing my remarks, so I did not actually listen to what he had to say.
What is your assessment, based on what you understand, of the issue here with Russia? Do you think that it's real? Do you think it's being handled in a serious enough way by the Republicans? And what do you make of what the emerging Democratic strategy on this?
So there's this question of cyber interference. Then there's this question of, was there a propaganda campaign that was somehow not the usual course of affairs, because we live in an ocean of propaganda campaigns. So was there something different about this propaganda campaign? And then the third question is, what's the nature of Trump's engagements with Russia, whether it's the government or the oligarchs or the mafia or the gangsters? Each of those are very important questions that are, under scrutiny right now. And I think time is going to tell. But just a brief comment about each of those issues. About cyber interference, we know that cyber interference is today's reality. It's kind of inconceivable that the Russians would not be probing cyber weaknesses, just like the U.S. is probing and looking for cyber weaknesses, including in our own corporations, where our collection of those cyber weaknesses just led to this crisis around the ransomware. Now, who's doing it more? I don't know. And maybe the Russians are far worse on this, but I don't know that. But the solution to it is not to go to war. And it's not to beat the war drums. The solution is to ensure that we have cybersecurity. And, for example, on our voting machines, we don't have cybersecurity. That's part of why I ran a recount campaign, so that we could actually elevate these issues and have a debate about it. And this debate is not over, by the way. Maybe that's another discussion. But we have 2 active lawsuits right now. So this is still not done. Our hope is to basically end the use of these very vulnerable, tamper-prone, error-prone electronic voting machines.
It seems like there's a there, that there are serious questions that need to be answered by people in Trump's immediate political circle about their contacts, there are questions about whether or not the Russians were successful in their cyber attacks against the U.S., whether it's phishing stuff with the DNC and other entities or any direct attacks that they may have attempted on voting machines or on the voting process. But we haven't seen concrete evidence. And a lot of Democrats and liberal pundits really seem to be fanning the flames of Cold War thinking again. And in fact, using the hammer and sickle on their signs at these rallies and Comrade Trump. And I think that that's not just sort of not funny humor, but it's a dangerous mentality. And I don't think it's just something that we should kind of laugh off as liberals being dumb. I think there's a very belligerent tone coming from very powerful Democrats in this country, and that concerns me. And I'm wondering what you think about the way the Democrats have approached that.
Yeah, so I don't know if you've seen any of the tweets that have gone out about me and my campaign and Green voters, some of them to Sanders voters as well. You know, there's extremely mean-spirited, nasty, rather vicious and violent campaign out there, which is not a healthy thing. From Rachel Maddow to, Bill Maher, who just hit an all-new low joking about the N-word, who said...
So you think Jill Stein is going to be president? Look me in the eye and tell me that.
We shall see. But it's going to be tough.
No.
Keith Olbermann, who says, it's largely your fault, you imbecile. That is Trump's withdrawal from the Paris Treaty. I didn't know I was that powerful, that's my responsibility. Kurt Eichenwald, saying he had to restrain himself from punching somebody out in the airport who he learned had voted for me. It's this kind of just really violent, vile sentiments that are out there. This is neo-McCarthyism. This is the new Cold War. This is incredible intolerance that doesn't move us forward. And it's wrong. It's wrong about the spoiling because, in fact, if you actually do the math here, the numbers don't add up. In any state, not in any state, if you account for the fact that most of our voters, Green voters, would not have voted, and of those who voted, more than 1/3 would have voted for Trump, et cetera. So it's not true in a single state that my staying home would have changed things. It's also not true that silencing political opposition is somehow going to solve this problem of this crisis in our democracy and the surge towards fascism.
Well, also, we don't have a monarchy in this country, or we're not supposed to. Like the Bushes and the Clintons, these aren't royal families that have a right to the throne. And I do think that there was a great deal of attitude about that in general from the Democratic Party about Hillary Clinton. Like it's her turn to be president. And what I found perhaps most ironic about some of the attacks against you, a line where it's like if you voted for the Green Party, you engaged in, de facto misogyny. Point out the fact that the Green Party's nominee was in fact a woman and that the vice presidential candidate was an African American. It's like defies common sense or logic or just kind of facts.
Exactly. This is not rational thinking. This is like the expression of people who are really distraught and angry and pissed off and looking for any way to express it. But it's really important for us to, I think, keep our eyes on the prize, maintain our civility. Let's create the democracy that enables us to choose the candidates that we want. We shouldn't be forced into this straitjacket in which the majority of Trump voters, I can't stress this often enough, majority of Trump voters were voting against Hillary and the Clintons. So we need a greater diversity of political choices. We're not going to solve this by silencing political opposition. That's a very dangerous thing to do. And because of the way that the neo-McCarthyism is hooked up with the new Cold War and the anti-Russia surge, this is a very dangerous moment. We have our nuclear weapons on hair trigger alert. And, we have surrounded Russia with nuclear weapons and missiles over the last couple of decades. Russia's been invaded a few times over the course of history, whether it was Napoleon or the Germans. So they're a little bit touchy about missiles moving to their borders in the same way that we were pretty touchy about missiles moving into Cuba. This is the Cuban missile crisis in reverse, on steroids. In fact, on crack. This is a very dangerous moment.
Do you believe that Trump makes it through a full term as president?
His days are numbered.
Okay. So his days are numbered for what reason?
Because daylight is now being shined on him. What we know is his massive liability are these 500 businesses that he has around the world and these entanglements. And these entanglements are already coming back to bite him. His appointment, for example, of Wilbur Ross to Commerce, who's a part of this bank in Cyprus that launders Russian money, that includes among its principals the guy that bought Trump's house at twice the cost that Trump had paid for it just a few years before. There's some very funny stuff going on here. Funny, rotten, stinking stuff related to Russian money laundering, Russian gangsters, who knows what. But there's no way Trump is going to be able to keep this secret. And his efforts to suppress and to interfere with an FBI investigation, which he admitted was his reason for firing Comey. There's no way he's going to be able to stop this investigation from going forward. He could well quit, but I think he will be forced to quit by daylight that is being shined on him. If he quits, put it this way, he's going to leave the presidency under the weight of his own massive corruption. Impeachment is necessary, but it may not get to that because he's going to become such a liability to the Republicans in the House seeking re-election that they're going to start flipping. I mean, people are lawyering up all over the place right now, and I think his support in Congress is going to diminish, and the American people are going to be very outraged. The people of South Korea recently impeached their president for corruption that I think looks like peanuts, if even, compared to what we're looking at with Donald Trump. So I think there is a realistic possibility of impeachment based on corruption. Impeachment is necessary, but it's not sufficient. We need a peaceful revolution at the ballot box.
Dr. Jill Stein, Green Party presidential candidate, thank you very much for joining us on Intercepted.
Great talking with you, Jeremy.
Thank you. Dr. Jill Stein was the Green Party candidate for president in 2016 and also in 2012. For more information about the Green Party, you can log on to gp.org.